We now welcome Keith Mcclelland, who comes to us from the legacies of British slave ownership.
Thank you very much. Let me to hold this thing. What I want to do is to talk for a little bit about the legacies of British slave ownership project, what we're up to, some of the implications of... You want this closer? Some of the implications of the work that we were doing. The project falls into two phases. Phase one was an examination over 3 years of basically the compensation records that were produced with the abolition of slavery in 1833. That is to say, British and other slave owners were compensated to the extent of £20 million following abolition in 1833. The enslaved, needless to say, received nothing. £20 million is an impossible figure to translate into modern terms, but to give you an idea, many of those compensated would receive, for example, £1,000, let's say. A well-paid artisan of 1830, 1835 has an annual income of around about £50. So £20 million spread over these owners is a great deal of money. How many owners were there? Well, there were about 46 to 47,000, of whom about 3,000 were resident or primarily resident in this country. So our project in the first phase was particularly concerned with not only digitizing the whole lot, but examining those 3,000 people living in Britain. And the purpose of this is, in one particular sense, to think about, well, what shape did Victorian, if you like to call it that, Victorian Britain have as a consequence of the monies and other activities of these absentee owners. That is to say, how does slave ownership shape 19th century Britain? And it, of course, links into wider sets of questions. In particular, what we are part of is a movement, in effect, that has taken place over the last 15 or 20 years to reinscribe the question of slavery, the question of slave ownership, the question of the slavery business as a whole into the narratives of British history. And that in turn is part of an even wider concern in some ways, which is the inscription of empire back into British history. That is to say that an understanding of British history is not possible except as one moment, as it were, of a wider global and imperial history. Well, the second point I want to make is about what we're doing, or what we've done in terms of the legacies of this. And I won't say much about this in this context, but simply to indicate. These 3,000 in particular that we're concerned with, we looked at the commercial and the financial legacies of these people, the political, the historical and cultural, and the imperial roles which they played. One important element of this is that something like, we reckon, 10% of British elites were connected more or less directly to slave ownership. And you can find these people in the City of London, in the Houses of Parliament, in local politics and local economies, particularly in places like Liverpool, Bristol, Glasgow, as well as London, and so on. So we were tracing biographically each of these people in order to think about aggregates, in order to think about conglomerates. The other point to make about that, before I move on to the specific question of race, is whilst the elites are clearly connected, or there are significant sections of them connected to slave ownership, what also matters is the very ordinariness of slave ownership. For example, if you look at our website, which is at ucl.ac.uk/LBS, then you will find a map of this area. And if you look at the area from Gower Street across through Bloomsbury, there are 70 or 80 people pinpointed as living in these streets around here at the point of compensation in the 1830s. And part of that is about the density of these people in this area. They're also connected with the founding of UCL, or there are some of them who are connected. It's partly about that, but it's also about the ordinariness of it. These are people who are inscribed in, are threaded through, as it were, the ordinary emergent commercial, industrial middle classes. There is nothing unusual, in a sense, about slave ownership. It's a specific form of property ownership, but in a sense there's nothing unusual about it. These are people who are not pariahs, and I'm going to come back to that point in just a moment. This is a forum about race. What has slavery and slave ownership to do with race? Well, it seems a stupid question, because of course slavery is about race. But it seems to me that one has to be a bit more specific than that, because race is not about colour. Race is about cultural constructions of certain notions of biological presumption, which are then articulated, most importantly in the modern world, in terms of colour, and that is why slavery matters, or that is one of the reasons why slavery matters. And in terms of thinking of the legacies of slave ownership in 19th and indeed 20th and 21st century Britain, one of the things that we're concerned with is, of course, the creation not only of the categorizations, often in the most appalling ways that we've just heard about, for example, the categorizations of, quote, black people, but also, of course, the categorizations of whiteness. One of this part of the underlying preoccupations of this project is indeed with the creation of whiteness and Britishness in the modern world and the articulations of that. Clearly, there are lots of different layers to the formation of notions of race. They're very historically specific. They depend upon particular conjunctures. All I would say at this point, to be very brief about it, especially as I've only 3.5 minutes left, I think, perhaps 4, is that one of the things I would emphasize is not only the cultural formation of notions of race that you get, for example, in mid-19th century Britain, from people like Alexander Knox in his Races of Man in 1850, and in the writings of Thomas Carlyle. But race depends so often, of course, on the political articulations of it, the inscription of it into particular political conjunctures of power and dominance. So that in the case of the legacies of British slave ownership, I would single out 4 particular moments in the succeeding 30 to 40 years. One of these is around the question of apprenticeship, and it leads into the question of indenture, which we heard about earlier. That is, apprenticeship was the period leading up to 1838, when it was finally abolished, when formerly enslaved were compelled to work for former slave owners, compelled to work for nothing, as part of the whole settlement of the slavery question. The question that arose in this was, are those of African descent capable of free labour? Are they capable of performing as wage labourers, potential wage labourers, in the way that white people were? That becomes, of course, then not only a political argument about the arrangements in post-slavery, the post-slavery British Caribbean, it also becomes a cultural argument about the qualities of Africanness, as it were. And that is being articulated in new ways in the mid-19th century, with a much harder distinction being drawn between, the quote, the black and the white. Second element seems to me the question of sugar, which we've also heard a bit about, because this is about the articulation of race and politics and the sustenance of empire. In what ways are you going to maintain a new kind of post-slavery empire in the Caribbean? That is to say, remove state support for West Indians, that is the planters. The West Indians is a term that arisen particularly in the 18th century for white owners. Remove state support, but at the same time sustain a British imperial economy within the Caribbean. How do you do that? Not least of the importance in that process is the question of indenture. Third issue seems to me about the Indian Mutiny, so-called, or the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which articulates in new ways the relationship of race, because it takes a group of people defined as a group, defined as a fiction, that is India, which is in many ways a fiction until, India is a fiction in many ways until 1947. But it says that these people who were formerly positioned in a particular hierarchy of races above the Africans because of the rebellion are actually, as it were, pushed down because of the threat that they pose to the British Empire. The fourth point is about the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, which sees a savage suppression of that rebellion by the British. Many of the people who support Governor Eyre, who is the Jamaican governor who had suppressed the rebellion, are themselves connected back to slave owners and slave ownership, sometimes directly because their fathers, for example, have been. The last point I want to make very briefly in 2 minutes, if I'm allowed 2 minutes, is the question of national identity and the articulations of race within that. Because our project is about saying slave ownership matters in 19th century Britain in ways which have not been discussed by other people. We are, of course, completely unique. But what it matters too is the ways in which the narrative of what British history has been about has been articulated in relation to slavery. And the key moment, listen to David Cameron, listen to Michael Gove, or before them, listen to Gordon Brown. The key moment for them is not the abolition of slavery in 1833 so much as the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. And what has been built is a narrative which says that what is unique about Britain, what is unique about British notions of freedom, tolerance, liberty, and so on, and this is positioned as different from France, for example, what is unique is that this was the country which abolished the slave trade, subsequently abolished slavery. That is, it displaces not the slave owner as a pariah figure, but as the slave owner is incorporated into that national narrative because those people themselves in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s are redescribing their own histories as ones in which, of course, they themselves contributed to the sensible, rational abolition of slavery. So they are, in a sense, reincorporated into a national narrative, which is then presented as superior to those other countries, for example, Brazil, which were much later in abolishing slavery. There is much more to be said about that. I have run over time. There we are.